session is going ahead. I've heard a little bit of the advanced tryouts of some of these papers, but I'm looking forward to hearing this. I mean, it's an important topic right now. I mean, the current administration is trying to strengthen U.S. competitiveness in agriculture and to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions by boosting innovation. And it's increasing government R&D. There's support for agribusiness through the bioeconomy research component of the CHIPS Act, and it's encouraging farmers to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through the Inflation Reduction Act. Similar policies have been used in the past, but of course, without good data, it's difficult to assess the impacts of these kinds of policy changes on innovation and farmer productivity. We need, obviously, measures of government inputs, some kind of data on the private sector agribusiness response to these changes, and then looking at farmers' response in terms of TFP and other measures. So excuse me a second. The good thing about this session is it really brings together the kind of data that we need to put together policy analysis on how these different kinds of policies have worked in the past. And so this session brings together both government inputs, private sector research and investments, and TFP by farmers. And of course, as those of you know who know me and my research know, that I'm always very excited to get new numbers on private sector R&D and innovation, because that's always one of the hardest things to track. So I'll just go through shortly the papers and introduce everybody. So the first paper presents the latest numbers on public sector agriculture research in the US. And Kelly Nelson from ERS is going to present that paper. The next two papers provide new measures of private sector research and innovation and describe some of the opportunities that they present for policy analysis. And those are Greg Graff's paper on the scope of technological innovations funded by venture capital. And Greg's from Colorado State. And presentation 3 is Matt Clancy's presentation on the state of agriculture research in states, new data from patents. Matt recently left Iowa State and now is an senior innovation economist at the Institute for Progress. Finally, and not least, because Soon-Ling did all the work to put this presentation, this session together, Soon-Ling Wang is going to present the latest TFP data for the US and some of the major factors that are driving these changes. Soon-Ling, of course, is at Economic Research Service. And then each of these presentations will be 15 minutes long, approximately. I'll try to keep everybody under control. And then we'll have time for James McDonald to lead off the discussion session, and then we'll open it up for general discussion. Now, I suggest that people that have questions and want to make sure they don't forget them by the end of the presentations, put questions in the chat box, and speakers can answer them as we go along by also in the chat box, because I think we're going to save the discussions until the verbal discussions until the end, and until after Jim's presentation, his comments. see, did I forget anything? So we won't have any questions except in the chat box until the end, and then we'll give it time for discussion. We have an hour and a half, I believe, for this session, and we will try to use it efficiently. So let me start by suggesting that Kelly Nelson put his PowerPoints up, and you can go ahead with your presentation, Kelly.
Mute here.
Okay, yeah, now we can, yeah.
All right, great. So this is some research that I did in the last couple of years with Keith Bugley, and it's on an overview of public agricultural R&D in the US, and a couple slides on it on international comparison. If any of you are at NC 1034, which I believe the majority of you were, this will not be particularly unfamiliar to you. So when we discuss public R&D, this is how we're defining it and delimiting it. So it's anything that's done internally by government agencies, it's done by universities, nonprofit organizations, and public-private arrangements, then we consider it public R&D.
We can't hear you very well, Kelly. You're going on and off.
Sorry, I'll try to get a little closer to the microphone.
Okay.
So I'm gonna, did anybody need me to repeat any of that? Pretty much just reading off that list there. Okay. That's how we're gonna be defining public R&D here. So this is the overall trend, the overall timeline starting in 1970. And you can see that the peak when adjusting for the R&D price index, which is an index also called a biomedical research index. It's developed by NIH and maintained by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and it controls for changing costs in research inputs. It was specifically biomedical, but it tracks very well with agricultural research as well. You can see the peak happened in the early 2000s, and then if you're adjusting for these prices, we're back to about where we were in 1970 in terms of effective expenditures. As far as the sources, this is for the most recent year we have from 2019. This is how it's broken down. You can see that federal funding is the largest source for public R&D. And then you can see that broken down further into USDA, non-USDA, and from that, USDA funding, whether it's being performed through grants to extramural institutions or whether it's being performed internally, which it primarily means the Agricultural Research Service, although Forest Service, AMS, ERS, other agencies are also performing R&D. And as far as the trends for intramural and extramural, here you can see that some of this decline, well, they both declined since early 2000, but you can see that the intramural research is actually a level below where it was in 1970.
I think your connection is not very good because you're going in and out. We can
give me 1 second. Let me see if I can change my audio settings. All right, is this any better? I just changed the noise filter in Zoom to see if it will stop blocking. Is this any better?
Right now it is.
Okay, so hopefully that will that'll be. It was on a high filter setting. So if you look at this trend here, you can see that the intramural research is below the level that it was in 1970. Although both the intramural and extramural have declined since the early 2000s. And what does this mean compared to other, or how does this compare to other countries? So here's a selection of large funders of agricultural research internationally to compare. And you can see now that China is the top funder of agricultural R&D. The European Union is also the second largest. And so
Yeah, we're still not hearing you well.
the purple line is the United States, and you can see that it's fallen behind the European Union and China in terms of R&D funding. We do not have as current of data for India, though it's possible based on those trends now that at this point, India has also surpassed the United States in terms of funding. And what is the significance of this, of why the U.S. falling behind some of these other countries in terms of R&D funding matters? It matters in terms of competitiveness of the of agricultural products on the export market for the U.S. Brazil is a large competitor with the U.S. in terms of soybean and corn exports, while India and China are large recipients, large export targets for the international market for grain and other products. And so Brazil, back when I worked at AMS, there was a lot of discussion of Brazil improving its infrastructure and becoming highly competitive against the United States on the export market. If it's also going to be surpassing the United States in terms of its agricultural R&D, then it can become even more competitive, and the U.S. might lose export share on the global market there. And if India and China are also improving their agricultural productivity through R&D, then there might be a decrease in demand as they are able to meet more of their own internal demand for agricultural products. So what are the next steps? So that was the overview. Where are some of the directions we're going to be taking this research in the future? So we're going to be looking at research expenditures by state and research area in order to incorporate them into the productivity data set, do some research on that. And then another direction for it is microdata on funding impacts from R&D to land-grant universities and other institutions. So here's a kind of preview of what we've been working on. This is high-level aggregated national funding for different topics and how it's broken down. Some of these categories I combined. So specialty crops, for example, wheat and small grains, those were combined because if you went by every variety of wheat separately, or every vegetable or fruit or nut separately, then you wouldn't really have very much resolution. So I combined them for this. Let's highlight a few here. So what's interesting about this is you can see that corn and soybeans are not really a high priority for public R&D. Those are crops that have a high priority for private R&D though. So from a public goods provision perspective, those are already being researched pretty heavily. So that knowledge, that innovation is out there private sector. Whereas wheat, there was a presentation at NC 1034 about how there's less of a private incentive to innovate for wheat and other small grains. And so it's important for the public sector to provide for some of that innovation. And similarly with specialty crops and forestry, there's less of a private incentive for those to be researched, and so it falls on the public R&D in order to take care of that. So if you need to contact me or Keith, here are our email addresses. Here are some ways you can follow ERS. I think ours are up on charts of those.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kelly. Since you ended shortly, there is one question just of clarification from Matt, which is asking if these international trends are all just public sector research, not public and private. Is that correct?
Yes, this is international public R&D, correct?
Yeah. Okay, great. Okay, so we'll move to our next speaker, who's Greg Graff.
Very good. Thank you, Carl. Can you hear me fine?
Yeah, yep.
All right. I'm going to begin presenting here on my system. And then go to share. Just being a little laggy here, sorry. Well, let's see now. That's giving you a desktop, or is that giving you the slides?
I'm seeing your desktop.
All right. It was not given an option for my second. Okay, here we go. Sorry, screen 2. There, you should be seeing it now.
Some places there. There, all right, good.
Okay. Yeah, a little interlude for technical issues, but here we go. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. For those who were at the Anaheim meetings, we are really pretty much covering the same ground, although we have done a slight amount of updating internally within our team since then, incorporating some of the feedback that we got there, and we'll appreciate any further feedback because this is really still a work in progress. It is involved in really an unanticipated amount of data work. It began as we were chatting beforehand as a cooperative research agreement between Colorado State University and ERS when Nicholas Rada was still on the staff at ERS. And Keith ended up taking over that cooperative research agreement after Nicholas left. But Nicholas continued interest in this research topic. And as he took up his position at the Office of the Chief Economist at the U.S. Patent Office, we continued our conversations, and subsequently we were able to arrange an agreement between the USPTO and Colorado State University. And so I've been working under, in fact, an interagency personnel agreement for the last year and a half. And then we were joined by Charles DeGrazia, who was a staff economist with the Office of Chief Economist at the USPTO at the time, and has since moved on to the Leonardo da Vinci Business School in Paris. But Charlie is a real expert, particularly at some of the semantic and name matching techniques that we've had to utilize in order to compile this data set. But what we're really motivated by here, let's see, our animations are a little bit unclear, but let me just bring all of this up. I think this is very familiar to the current audience, but of course, ongoing and potentially even increasing challenges to U.S. agriculture is being serviced by the agricultural R&D, both in the public sector and in the private sector. And as Kelly just very clearly laid out for us, we have observed this stagnation or decrease in public sector research and development. But I also want to point out that much of that public sector research is dominated by either the federal government or large state institutions, land-grant universities primarily. And we do see steady increase in private sector R&D, at least according to the latest numbers, which are not entirely up to date. But again, we see domination by large organizations in the private sector data that we track. Very interesting treatment by Christy Lee in her dissertation at University of Minnesota in 2019 established that consolidation of the R&D actors within US agriculture, and also highlighted that the average R&D intensity is increasingly right skewed, again, supporting that consolidation story. She also provides evidence that corporations' R&D spending really is driven by their cash flow to capital stock ratio. And the implication there is really that industry, the corporate sector, is spending, if you will, rationally at its limits of available cash. They're not sitting on pots of gold that could be further invested in agricultural research and development if only they made some sort of administrative choice to do so. Against this backdrop that we've observed in the last decade, the real entry and surging of venture capital as, if you will, a third source. It is private sector research and development spending, but it has historically not been a major factor in this sector. In fact, here we're illustrating at a global level, mind you, using first a corporate R&D expenditure series created by Keith Fugly at ERS that was current through 2014, with then a linear projection to 2021, bringing us up to about $50 billion in corporate R&D expenditures in agriculture and food globally by the current time. And then drawing on a small outfit from San Francisco called Ag Funder that publish an annual report on venture capital investments in agriculture and food startups globally. Their latest number shows venture capital investments in ag and food exceeding what we project corporate R&D spend would have been in 2021. This is estimate at best, mostly designed to really focus our attention on the increasing importance of these venture investments in the sector. A number of folks have explored this explosion in VC funding in agriculture. There's first the fundamental motivation that commodity prices focused attention on opportunities and needs for investment, but those higher commodity prices also gave farmers ability to spend more on adopting new technologies. This was likely also helped by policy shifts toward biofuels in the 2000s during the previous real run-up in oil prices and the explosion in the bioeconomy and biofuels investment. And we have anecdotal evidence that a number of venture capital investors, if you will, kind of discovered agriculture coming into it through this side door of having invested in biotech and biofuels development companies. We also have been able to document that there's just simply been a large increase in the overall supply of venture capital being invested in the US market. And in fact, if anything, the trends in agriculture track fairly closely to this overall supply issue. And we also have a story of really the culmination of even decades worth of investment into a range of different general purpose technologies, ranging from internet and computing all the way to bio, gene editing, and others. We can think blockchain or artificial intelligence as well. Finding applications in the industry of agriculture, where, of course, colleagues of ours and many people on this call have documented the high internal rates of return. So it can be anticipated that agriculture would be, fertile ground, pardon the pun, for investments in applying these general purpose technologies. So what we're plunging into right now is trying to explore the question of whether or not venture capital investments in agriculture are really sticking to the traditional sectors in which VC has largely focused, which would be, the semiconductors, software, biotech, maybe internet platforms. Or how is it expanding in agriculture? And to what extent is this venture capital investment in agriculture really driving innovation? What's the nature of the ag innovation? In which subsectors of the industry are these ag tech startups operating, and what technology classes, what types of technologies are they driving forward? And in order to do this, we've compiled a very disparate data set. We're really drawing from 3 very different sources. We begin with proprietary venture capital private equity firm databases. Well, they're both firm and finance data on those firms. And we began by allowing these various venture capital databases to really speak to us as to what startup companies or what privately held companies that they have recorded in their data claim to be engaged in the agricultural industry based on industry sector classifications, or in some of them, in particular pitch book, there are also indicators of the technologies that companies are working with and advancing. So we were able to pull out agriculture, ag biotech, various applications of precision and things like that. We also constrained to founding year because there are a number of very long-standing privately held firms in the data that were started well before 1977. We chose the starting date of 77 because there was a crop of ag biotech companies that started to come into the industry as early as the first half of the 80s. And we did want to capture as much as we could that kind of pre-history of the startup phenomenon in agriculture. But really most of the narrative here is after 2010. We then match, the Microsoft enumeration, number 2 should be the National Establishment Time Series, the NETS database. NETS only began in 1989, for those of you that are familiar with the NETS data. It is an annualized or a time series based database at the establishment level of analysis. So one firm can have multiple establishments. The Dun and Bradstreet, the Duns number is really the core identifier in the NETS time series. And what we've done is matched companies that we discovered from the venture capital databases as operating in agriculture to the NETS data. And the NETS gives us, of course, annual employment, annual sales, and a plethora of other variables. Some real, some estimated, but it's a very well-established source for this kind of company information, establishment information. And then third and finally, in order to get at the questions about innovation, is we matched the firms identified in the venture capital databases to the US Patent Office data, both at the pre-grant publication level, the PG pubs, as they are known colloquially in the Patent Office, and the US granted patents from the Patents View database. Just a bit more about our overall venture capital data exercise. This first under the ERS cooperative agreement and then under the USPTO follow-up funding really was being pursued globally. We've found, however, that drawing from multiple data sources, we were getting multi-counting. And in fact, almost 5,000 companies globally that we had identified were showing up in more than one of the 4 data sources. And we could only really disambiguate that based on a fuzzy name matching process, as well as a lot of just hand cleaning of the data. But we then reduced each firm to a single data source. The single best data source then speaks for each of the startup companies in the overall data set. We found a lot of bloat in a number of countries in firm counts coming from Capital IQ, and did a bit of a cleanup there because we had a lot of just traditional farms and ranches and old ag co-ops and things like that. And this overall resulted in 35,000 companies globally, roughly. For those of you familiar with our previous exercise that we did for the NBER Ag Research and Innovation conference several years ago, in that exercise, we had a total of under 5,000 companies. So we've increased that by 7-fold with this new data process.
Greg, we've got about 2 minutes to go.
Oh dear, okay. Well, we've got the database here. Of these about 10,000, or roughly a third, are US-based startups. And these are what we then essentially matched to the data from the patent office. Our animation here is a little off. We matched to the nets, and we then have the subset of the ag tech firms that actually have financial deal information. So ultimately what we are using here is the subset of the ag tech to nets data match, which is it's the subset, the larger subset on the right-hand side of this image that indicates 6,084 ag tech startups. And you can see the intersections then with the others. But in interest of time, let me just get through our summary statistics and give you the bottom line of the overarching trend then. In that match subset of the 6,084 firms, we show here those startups without financial deals information in gray and those with financial deals information in blue. And you can see the trend after the mid-2000s of the uptick in companies disclosing various types of venture capital and private equity investments in the firms. Not to say that there weren't any in the 80s and 90s, although as you can see, there was a fairly steady trend up until about 2003. Looking at that subset in nets, what we see are the average growth rates for US ag tech startups in the database here in terms of both sales growth and employment growth starts at a higher rate when the company is younger and fairly predictably moderates itself down to about 10% by the time the startup is about 13 years old. This follows what has been called Gebrat's law in the literature, which simply states the somewhat intuitive finding that younger, smaller firms tend to grow more quickly. A second generalized finding that we pull from this data is to show that sales and employment, first of all, start at a lower rate and then actually catch up and potentially even exceed in those companies that are reporting investment deals relative to companies that do not have deals. In other words, it's more likely that companies with lower initial sales and employment are seeking this venture capital private equity funding, and then when they get it, they end up growing more quickly. Turning now to the matching with the patent data, we see here both the pre-grant publications, or described as applications in the graphic, as well as the granted patents by filing year for the identified matches to the venture capital funded companies in the data set. And you can see again the upturn after the early 2000s and the surge then by the 2010s. We then undertook an exercise of matching the industry category of the startup company to the patent class of their held portfolios. And we broke it out by decades. And the current image here shows you the company classifications in the data in the 1990s on the left-hand side based on the NEX number. And you can see up top is agriculture, forestry, fishing, and hunting. And then it steps down through the entire series of the NEX index system. You see that the largest category is 54 professional, scientific, and technical services. On the right-hand side, we have the community patent class, the CPCs, formerly known as the IPCs, for the patents held by those companies that were granted prior to 98. And you can see the mapping or the crosswalk here between industry category and the patent category of the firms. And by 98, we only had 97 granted patents. So what is represented in this image is the crosswalk for those roughly 100 patents. If we look from 99 to 2008, roughly the decade of the 2000s, we are now tracking over 300 patents that were granted to startups in that decade. And you see that the image is fleshing out. And then if we go to the 2010s, 2009 to 21, basically, a much more rich mapping where there's a proliferation of both the NEX codes that companies are identifying with and the patent classes that they are filing in. So overall, to conclude the trends, we do see a substantial increase in patenting by ag tech startups over the course of these 3 decades. We see great diversification of the technology fields or CPCs, but also an increasing number of the NEX. Among company categories, the greatest increase of patenting is in manufacturing and the professional, scientific, and technical services. But among the patent classes, there is steady growth in the ag and food category, but we see biotech and chemical taking off even more quickly, as well as the latter series in the CPCs, which at the high level are described as physics, electrical, and new technology developments, the Y categories, which are largely climate and clean tech. So the bottom line and the punchline of this stage of our analysis is that indeed, yes, we see a vast expansion in the scope of technological innovations funded by venture capital. And I'll go ahead and tie it off there, Carl.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Greg. Okay, let's see. So Matt, if you can get your PowerPoint ready for action.
All right. As soon as Greg stops sharing the screen, I think I can take over. All right.
There you go.
There we go. And everybody see that?
Yeah, looks good.
Great. So I did not have a chance to present this at NC 1034, so this is something new, I think. I'm happy to have the chance to tell you guys all about this. This is a project that I started, kind of spun out from a cooperative agreement with ERS that I worked on when I was at Iowa State University. And this is the first time it's been, I guess I did a brown bag on ERS, but I think it's evolved since then. Anyway, this is about, well, you can see the title. Let me go to the slide to tell you what I tried to do here. So what this little paper tried to do was come up with a new data set that estimates private sector agricultural R&D in each of the 50 states over roughly 40 years from 1976 to 2014. And the way we did that is we took advantage of the fact that there are these estimates of national R&D spending in different agricultural subsectors. And we can, a lot of those subsectors, in fact, the majority have reasonably rich sort of patenting behavior. So we grabbed patents from those sectors, and we're going to use the geographic distribution of the patents in the same years to sort of try to estimate where the R&D is taking place. So that's sort of the first half of this presentation or so. And then the second part is I've got this new data set. And so I did some very, kind of first pass, the kinds of things you would do to, since this is sort of, I think, as far as I know, this is a new data set about what's going on in the private sector and where is it happening in agricultural R&D. So I've got some sort of preliminary descriptive analysis, which I call new facts. The first one, I'm not sure if it's a surprising fact or more of just a validation of the data, but I kind of show that this, private sector agricultural R&D at the state level seems to be pretty strongly correlated with that state's agricultural orientation. I'll talk more about that in a minute. I also show that where agricultural R&D over this time period happens tends to be quite persistent in the sense that if you knew what a state was doing in the 80s, you could have a reasonable estimate of what it's going to be doing in the 2000s. And I have a section on how the geographic concentration of private sector agricultural R&D has changed to some degree over the decades, and it's actually become more dispersed, although that's reversed a little bit recently. I'll just clarify also that all of this work goes through 2014, and if we remember Greg's chart showing how venture capital took off, you'd notice that this is still the era of sort of pre-VC in his stuff. So I'd be interested, now that he has this patent link, maybe these trends will change a lot in the 8 years since 2014. But that's not what I'm going to talk about today. So how do we build this data set? The basic approach leverages earlier work I did with Giancarlo Moschini, Paul Heisey, and Yongji Ji, where we identified about 50,000 US patents in different agricultural sectors. I'm going to interpret these patents as a signal of private sector R&D effort, because in that work we showed the vast majority of patents go to private sector organizations. The public sector is just a tiny rounding error, sort of. Importantly, patents identify who the inventors are and where those inventors live, which we're going to use to infer where R&D is happening. And then I'm going to use the sector-specific patenting by state, to allocate the headline private sector R&D by the same sector to the states. So how do we identify agricultural patents? Well, our kind of focus was lots of technologies could be used for agriculture, but we're going to focus on sort of primary stuff that the R&D is primarily intended to be develop some kind of tool for agriculture or to do research with agricultural applications. We mostly use the cooperative patent classification system that Greg just talked about. We have 5 main categories that we can get there. In our original paper, we did a lot of work to break down that last sector into plants and research tools. That was a lot of work by Paul Heisey that was sort of manual hand coding. We're going to merge that back for this paper because that better matches the R&D data we have. We don't have R&D data broken down by plant varieties and plant breeding technologies, and it's not totally clear if you conceptually can't even split those. But I bring this up because we have one last data set. Veterinary medicine is a reasonably large chunk of private sector R&D in our data set, and we identify animal health patents in a different way that makes them sort of non-comparable if we're just looking at the headline number. So there is no, as far as I know, cooperative patent classification code for technologies related to veterinary medicine. So instead, I have an earlier paper with Stacy Sneeringer where we pulled all of the FDA-approved drugs for veterinary medicine. That goes back to the, back before the 80s. And each of those drugs lists the patents that protect the drug. And so we derive a database of veterinary medicine patents from that list of FDA, patents associated with FDA-approved veterinary drugs. And so the important thing is that the cooperative patent classification system kind of gives you something like a census of all the patents in these different sectors. Whereas this animal health one, we're going to be looking at a subsample that's kind of like a high quality subsample, because these are patents that protect drugs that did eventually get approved. Okay. And so if we were just comparing the number of patents, This would make this section sort of non-comparable. We're going to be mostly looking at the geographic distribution of where the activity happens. And so I think that this is still useful. So here's a quick example. Here's a patent, actually for animal health for treating equine protozoal myoencephalitis. We can see when it was filed, in this case, 1996, and we're going to use that as our proxy for when R&D associated with this patent happened. And we can see the inventors listed. In this case, this patent had 2 inventors, one based in Iowa and one based in Kentucky. So we're going to say this is a signal of sort of 50% effort. 50% of this patent we're going to give to Iowa, 50% to Kentucky. A lot of these sectors, have a non-negligible share of patents that come from other countries. Obviously, those guys are excluded from our data set because we're trying to figure out US patenting. So, already when you have patents, you can imagine that that's some kind of measure of private sector agricultural effort. But there's some sort of tricky things about using patents as just a measure of effort. One is the amount of R&D associated with a patent is likely to vary across sectors. Some sectors are going to use patents really heavily. Some sectors, they may only patent, 1 out of 5 inventions if they can't protect it through secrecy and other things. So how much R&D effort is associated with a patent could easily differ between animal health and fertilizer and so on. And second, over time, the appeal of seeking a patent has probably changed. There was a large run-up in the number of patents that were filed annually beginning in the sort of 1980s. And at least part of that is probably driven by changes in law, basically, that made patents more attractive. And so this is another reason why patents may not be so comparable across time. What this paper is going to do is, instead of measuring R&D effort by the number of patents, we're going to measure R&D effort in R&D dollars, which we think will be comparable. You can compare a dollar in one sector to a dollar in another. You can adjust for inflation and compare across time. There was a paper, a report by ERS back in 2011 that calculated private sector U.S. agricultural R&D for a bunch of subsectors. This got later updated. The trouble for us is that this is just sort of headline national numbers, but I'm going to use the geographic distribution of associated patents to try to parcel out all of that, all of those headline figures. So here's sort of the main sectors that we were able to find patent analogs to. So on the left column, we've got the sectors that there exists these national private sector R&D figures. And in the middle, we've got patent series that we came up with that we think closely match those. And on the right column, we've got the share of total private sector ag inputs R&D associated with those sectors. Okay, so we don't have any good patent analogs for animal genetics or animal nutrition. Those are sectors that either don't use the patent system very much, or we don't have a good way to identify the patents in those sectors that are there. But fortunately, those seem to account for a pretty small share of overall R&D. Let's see. And yeah, as you can see, we have an R&D series for crop seed and biotechnology in general. We actually had a data series for plants and a patent data series for plant, breeding research type stuff. We just merged that together to sort of figure out the geographic distribution of R&D effort associated with crop seed and biotech. So
I found this on the web.
Sorry, there's my phone talking to me. All right. This figure here is going to give you a rough idea of kind of why I think this sort of shows a couple things. One, why it's not such a good idea maybe to use patents as a pure measure of R&D effort, but also that they're not like crazy. So what this figure shows is, on the vertical axis, the total amount of R&D spending in a particular sector in a particular year. And on the horizontal axis, the number of US patents that we give to that sector in the US in the same year. And so for plants, biocides, and machinery, these things actually kind of work together pretty well. In years when there is more, in sectors where there's more R&D, we also see more patents. And in years when there's more R&D, we see more patents. You can see, though, that the fertilizer section, which is that blue cloud that's down below, they kind of are off that trend line. So they basically seek more patents relative to the amount of R&D that's spent, which kind of gets to this non-comparability issue I talked about. And similarly, this animal health stuff, they're above the line and to some degree. And that indicates that this sort of hints at this selection issue I talked about, where we're only sort of observing the really good animal health patents that got associated with FDA-approved drugs. We're not counting all of them, and so there's fewer patents per R&D dollar in that industry. And you can also see that with the exception of, at least in 3 of these sections, they kind of are in these clouds that don't move around much. And that indicates that the total amount of patenting and the total amount of R&D dollars spent in a given year didn't move around that much over the 40-year period. The one sector where the amount of R&D changed dramatically was the plant sector, where we went from very low levels of R&D spending and very low levels of patenting to very high levels by the end of our sample. And that's reasonably well tracked by our data here. Animal health has some strange dynamics associated with, where the number of patents fell off a lot. And that's partially a truncation problem where we don't observe recent patents because we have to observe the FDA drug that they're associated with getting approved before we observe the patents. But we don't think it's totally down to that, because the number of approvals for animal health also went down over this period. And I can talk a lot more about that, and I won't right now. The upshot is that these things are correlated, just raw, and on this figure, this R squared is like 0.36. If you exclude animal health, which is sort of drawn from a different population, the R squared is significantly higher. So here's the basic idea. Here's going to illustrate how we parceled out R&D in a particular year. So here's the year 2000, and we've got 5 different sectors. Underneath each sector, you can see how much money that sector spent on R&D according to the Fugly et al. Estimates. And these pie charts are just meant to illustrate, this is each segment is what share of inventors belong to each of the different 50 states. Okay, so we're going to divide up the money and flow it out to the inventors associated with the patents applied for in the same year.
Matt, could you start sort of wrapping up?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to have 5 minutes or 2 minutes.
Well, 2 minutes or 5, either one.
Okay. I'll try to be quick. All right. So boom, that's how we get these estimates. So let me try to give you in the last couple minutes some descriptive data. So the first thing I wanted to do was, how do you know if you're right here, right? And we don't actually have any good benchmark for private sector R&D, but we would kind of expect it to be correlated with private sector agricultural production or public sector R&D at the state level, and we do have data on that. So one section tries to run this regression where basically how correlated is our estimate of state level R&D in a particular year with the level of agricultural production or public sector R&D in the same year. You add in time fixed effects, maybe state fixed effects. Here's the coefficients. If the line is darker, it's more statistically significant. And the takeaway is that there's usually a pretty good relationship between the amount of agricultural production in a state and the amount of private sector agricultural R&D that we estimate, even though these come from completely different data sources, okay? When it comes to public sector R&D, there's no statistically significant correlation between the two once you add in state fixed effects, which I think capture the sort of overall agricultural orientation of a state. So there's no time series correlation between those two. All right. So I call this shocking because I'm not sure if to call this a fact or like a validation exercise, but there you go. I'm going to skip all this and go to this last section here. Changing geography. So we know where the R&D is happening, or at least we have estimates, and we can use that to see how things are changing over time. So here we have the average agricultural R&D spending in the 1980s, and then in the 2000s on the vertical axis. And we just take the log of the average. And you can see these things are super highly correlated, R squared of 0.87. So if I knew how much R&D your state did in the 80s, I can predict pretty well what it's going to be doing in the 2000s. You can see there's this one outlier here. This is Maine. And This outlier seems to be driven by a small number of animal health patents, particularly 4 animal health patents that came out in years when we see that there was a lot of animal health R&D spending, but there were very few patents applied for in that year. The ones that were applied for went to Maine, and so Maine looks really strong by that measure. So if you exclude that, you get a super tight correlation. But I don't want to totally just exclude it. Maybe the R&D, animal health R&D really did start moving to Maine. And this here is sort of meant to show when you added in state fixed effects, you know, we found that these agricultural production of your state was pretty predictive of how much R&D, private sector agricultural R&D happened there. That kind of thing probably didn't change a lot over time either. And so, yeah, I think this sort of illustrates this sort of persistence and this role of, you know, the agricultural orientation of your state. But the last thing I'm going to talk about is the concentration of private agricultural R&D. And I just computed a Herfindahl concentration index for private agricultural R&D. We got 50 states. And because I'm worried that any year to year, like we might have things like the state of Maine where a couple of years of the right, you know, patenting in a couple of years when not many other people patented might make it seem like you're an outlier. We're going to try to smooth that by using the preceding 5 years for each data point. And then I'm going to compare this to 2 benchmarks, which is first, just the distribution of agricultural real value added. So agricultural production, where is it happening in the states? And second, non-agricultural patenting to sort of get trends in the concentration of innovation.
I think your 5 minutes are about up.
Okay, this is the last slide. This is the headline. Yeah, so the gray line is non-agricultural patenting. The black line is private agricultural R&D Herfindahl concentration index. What's my takeaway? Agricultural private sector R&D has always been more concentrated than where agricultural happens, but that's fallen over time. And it has kind of defied a trend towards increasing concentration of innovative activity that has been seen outside of agriculture over this period. And yeah, that's my summary of what I just talked about. And the whole reason for starting this cooperative was actually to see how this stuff is going to link to state level agricultural TFP, which we haven't done yet, but I think that's in the works. And then I have some suggestions for lots of other things I hope that people can use this data for. So that's what I'll say. And I'm happy to talk more about it later.
Okay, thanks, Matt. So we'll go right on to Sun Ling. Let's see.
Can you see my screen?
We can see somebody swimming.
Okay, so it's not the slides. Okay, sorry. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, now we can.
Okay. Thanks, Carl. I really enjoy the presentation earlier. So we all know that all the purpose for the public R&D and private R&D and all those large stock are to make sure we can have a sustainable agricultural productivity growth to meet the increasing demand for the food and fibers globally. So in my following presentation, I will base on the U.S. agricultural productivity data and also some research finding to provide some discussion regarding the future of productivity growth. So in my following presentation, I will start to introduce some background regarding the U.S. agricultural productivity data and also share with you some findings from the most recent updates and talk about some causes and drivers of agricultural productivity growth from both the long-term and short-term perspective. I will also show some projected and actual U.S. agricultural TFP growth based on different R&D investment scenarios. And at the end, I will have some discussion regarding future productivity growth and challenges. So the background. So regarding the USDA's U.S. Agriculture Productivity Program, in 1960s, ERS was the first agency to introduce a multi-factor productivity measurement into the federal statistical program. To improve the quality of the data over time, ERS has implemented 2 external reviews. The first one was conducted in 1978, made by an AAEA task force. And the most recent one was conducted in 2014 by Shun Wei and a panel of experts. So ERS has incorporated some major changes in measuring capital, labor, intermediate inputs and output. Therefore, today, the U.S. Agriculture Productivity Program bases its productivity statistics on a sophisticated system of production accounts. The findings. In this chart, on the top, the green line is the total farm output. At the bottom, the blue line is the total input. In the middle, the pink line is the total factor productivity. Before 1948 and 2019, agricultural output increased by 175% at an annual rate of 1.4%. And total input use increased slightly by 4% at an annual rate of 0.06%. Therefore, TAP increased by 163% at an annual rate of 1.36% is a major driver of the U.S. farm output growth. Comparing to other sectors, according to Jorgensen's study, agriculture TAP in the U.S. its growth rate is among the highest in the U.S. sectors. So this chart shows the output between the crops and the livestock commodities. So over time, agriculture output has more than doubled, with crop output growing much faster and also more volatile than livestock output. And this chart shows the disaggregation of the crop category. So from 1948 to 2019, oil crops on the top line, the green line, showing the commodities of the oil crops grew much faster than other commodities at the highest rate among all crops. And the soybeans account for about 90% of US oilseed production. So this chart shows the livestock. We have 3 subcategories: meat animals, poultry and eggs, and the livestock, other commodities. So according to this chart, we can see that although the meat animals accounted for the largest share of livestock production, poultry and eggs grew much faster than other subcategories. So in the first chart, we saw the total input grew slightly over time. However, the composition of individual inputs has changed dramatically. So between 1948 and 2019, the orange line is an intermediate goods showing that it increased by 126%, grew much faster than other input. And capital excluding land increased by 79%. And land decreased by 28% over time. Therefore, land productivity grew nearly 4 times. And labor increased by 74%, decreased by 74%. Therefore, labor productivity grew much more than 10 times. The sources of agricultural growth. In the USDA's data set, there is a decomposition of the total farm output growth into its source of growth, including input growth and the TAP growth. Input growth was further decomposed into labor input growth, capital growth, and also the intermediate goods changes. So over time, according to the first column, we can see that TAP growth accounted for most of the output growth over time. And among the different inputs, intermediate goods account for most of the total input growth, with labor declining, capital, because capital including land in this category also declining over time. However, among all different sub-periods, they may have different contribution from the TIP growth and the input growth. In the last sub-period between 2007 to 2019, we can see that the input growth contribute to negative 0.06 percentage point to the output growth of 0.61 percentage point per year. And we can see the first time the capital contributed positively to the output growth over a long period of time. And then the TIP growth continue to contribute mostly to the output growth. And no matter which sub-period we are seeing, TIP growth is always the major driver of output growth, except in the first sub-period in the post-World War II period. So in the US data product, we also decompose the input growth decomposition into the quantity change and also the quality changes. So over time, we can, on top, the red bar indicate the quality contribution, and the blue bar indicate quantity contribution. So over time, labor quality contribute to the output growth much more than the quality changes in other categories. And this is for the most recent sub-period, and we can see slightly different regarding the composition between quality changes and quantity changes among different categories. So this is labor quality versus labor quantity changes over time. So in the chart, the green line at the bottom is the total labor input changes, and the red bar on top is the quality changes, and the blue bar at the bottom is the quantity changes. So over time, output annual growth rate was 1.42%, and percentage points contribution from changes in labor input. We can see from labor quantity is actually negative 0.55 percentage points. So it's nearly, I think, 40% of the output changes. And labor quality contributed positively 0.13 percentage points to annual output growth rate. And total labor input contribute to output growth at 0.42 percentage point per year. So what's the drivers or the causes of agricultural productivity growth from the short-term and long-term perspective? So this chart shows the annual TIP growth rate and the output growth rate. So the blue line is the output annual growth rate, and the pink line is the annual TIP growth rate. So we can see that the output growth actually fluctuate from year to year in response to adverse weather or some transitory events. But those changes will always return to its long-term trend line. So we can see on average, it's fluctuate mostly above the zero, the horizontal line. And TIP growth rate moves more closely with the volatile output growth rate than the input growth. And long-term drivers of TIP growth, as Kelly presented earlier, and also Greg and Matt presented earlier, we know that the public R&D and the private R&D, they are the major drivers for the TIP growth in the long term. However, public R&D has declined. The real public R&D has declined since 2006. And private R&D investment continue to increase. And other factors that may also affect the long-term TIP growth include extension and also the infrastructure, such as roads, irrigation system, broadband, electricity, etc. So we just saw the chart. The public R&D has declined, but the private R&D has increased. So can the private R&D substitute the public R&D? So from this chart, we want to show you the private R&D and the public R&D, actually they have different focuses in their research investment. So the pink bar is the investment from the private sector, and the public sector is showing us the blue bar. So we can see that the private sector has more focuses on the food manufacturing, the crops, and the farm machinery. However, the public sector's R&D has more focuses on the crop, animals, and environmental and the natural resources, as well as human nutrition and the food safety. So this chart we based on the empirical study using the state level productivity information, and also the public R&D, including their spillover effect. So based on the evidence from the research finding, we conduct scenario analysis with 3 public R&D investment scenarios. The first one is R&D increased by 1% per year in real dollar. And the second one is R&D continue to in the constant nominal dollars. And the third scenario is R&D investment is constant in nominal dollars, however, with one-time cut of 25% in 2014. So we actually conduct the scenario analysis back in 2015 earlier. So in this chart, we can see that the pink line is the actual TIP trend line, and then the blue line is a historical trend. And then based on the scenario analysis, we can see the forecasted TIP trend line didn't change much and didn't apart from each other between 2010 and 2020. However, it changed dramatically after 2020.
Sun-Ling, could you start wrapping up, please?
Yes, yes. So the TIP impacts under different scenarios during early stage are rather small, as it takes time for research investment to affect TIP growth. However, between 2010 and 2050, agricultural productivity grows differently by about 80%, 40%, and 30% under different scenarios. And this is, we include the more recent TIP actual TIP growth rate. So we can see that the pink line start to fall below the trend line. So since 2005, public R&D has declined at 3% per year on average, and TIP growth rate has slowed in recent years. So my last slide. So under climate change, the frequency of extreme weather has increased and may result in more impacts on short-term productivity growth rate. And agricultural productive growth is among the highest in US industries. And US farm sector also depends more on TIP growth than other sectors. So can this TIP growth persist? Is US TIP growth rate sustainable in supporting future needs? And public R&D investment has been stagnant. Is the increase in private R&D investment enough and adequate to substitute for the role of public R&D? And that's my presentation.
Great. Very nice, Sun-Ling. Jim, if you could start us off with your comments, and then we'll have some questions and discussion.
Yeah. Big broad comments first. Each of these are focused on major data development efforts. And they also, as we all kind of grapple, I think, with interrelated developments that are also new, given that in this world, productivity, innovation, things like that. New means things that have been going on now, but also in the last 20 years. And in those cases, it's things that are really different from what we thought we knew about the world 20 years ago. To me, there's at least two big questions coming out of the combined work. And then I'm going to give a few comments specifically on each paper. One big question is, what's the decline of public R&D mean for private R&D and also for VC R&D? That's been a big policy issue. It's going to continue to be one with this continued decline in public R&D. Secondly, how does non-ag public and private research, specifically in biology and IT, affect ag R&D, ag patenting, and ag productivity? I think it fairly leaps out of the VC stuff that Greg Graff is talking about, but it certainly lays behind some of the issues in a number of the other papers. Let me shift over for a few specific questions so I can leave time for other people on each of the papers. First, for Kelly Nelson, I'd mentioned this ANSI 134 presentation, and I'll just repeat it. I would like to see more detail in the presentation on the price indexes themselves, because price indexes in the last couple of decades vary a lot across different sources, and for good reasons. But I think it'd be good to emphasize what this price index looks like. Secondly, I didn't notice this the first time I saw the presentation, but it appears to me that the international comparisons are in real dollars. And I'd like to see more on, are we using the same deflator? Or what are the deflators for which we're doing real dollars across countries? For Sun Ling's presentation, there's been a long argument in the profession over a slowdown in ag TFP growth, for which we, meaning people at ERS, have generally taken the position that there hadn't been a slowdown. I think right now with the update of the ERS accounts, we can see 20 years of relatively slow output in TFP growth. And I wonder if that's not an issue that we should return to with an explicit review and analysis. Relatedly, what we see in that data that Sun Ling presented is not only slow TFP growth, but slow output growth in agriculture since 2000. Now, we usually in the productivity world assume that the causation goes from TFP to output, except when we do our little sleight of hand to account for the fluctuation, year-to-year fluctuations. And there we refer to weather and other policy issues that affect output and therefore wind up affecting TFP as the output change affecting TFP. But there is a long tradition going back to Verdorn's law and Nicholas Kaldor in the 50s and 60s, arguing that in the intermediate and long term as well, output growth could affect measured productivity growth. And that may also something harder to do, but something we might want to be thinking about since we do have this substantial decline in ag output growth. Shifting over to Greg Graff's presentation, from his chart, the VC explosion to me, as Matt Clancy pointed out, appears to be post-2012, post-2013, meaning post-global commodity boom. And I wonder if that should cast doubt on the argument that the global commodity boom is a driver. We seem to see an explosion during the global commodity price collapse. Next, when should we see an impact of this VC investment on ag TFP growth? I say should we because some of this is obviously aimed at food, which shouldn't affect ag TFP growth. Some of it likely affects output quality, and we don't know whether that's tricky about whether it's going to affect measured TFP growth. So I would like to start to see more of a connection to how much of this is about ag and how much is about food. And I think what you've done so far is exactly what you ought to be doing with this deep data dig and summaries. But I'd like to start seeing, more case studies. To me, when I think of VC and ag, I think of vertical farming and I think of precision chemical applications, see and spray technologies like John Deere has now. And you know, what I'd like to know is, am I wrong? Is there more out there than those types of big, broad areas? And I think we're getting to a point where that's something that could be pursued. Finally, for Matt, this is more, his work obviously is more preliminary than others, somewhat more dated. I just had a couple of questions. One, as you're tying it to ag via value production growth to patents, could you detail it more? Specialty crops, field crops, livestock tied to patents falling in those areas. Does ag value added matter? In the East Coast, a place like North Carolina or Delmarva Peninsula, we import almost all our feed, meaning value production is going to be significantly different than value added. Does it matter if we're choosing one or the other? And then finally, you know, HHIs are highly nonlinear measures of concentration. Is that shift you're seeing something that we would actually call a concentration change? There are scales of an HHI index in which a large change means not that much of a change in concentration, and others in which it means a big change in concentration. So I'd like to see just a little bit more digging behind that. Okay, that's what I've got on these presentations. They were all real. There was a great panel.
Yeah, I agree. This really fit together nicely. Do you guys want to respond to Jim's comments quickly? We just have 2 questions in the chat. Well, maybe I'll just have everybody look at the chat. I mean, you know, we've got one question to Greg, or what percentages of patents in agriculture related to Internet of Things, and Greg, to everyone. Let's see. That is one of our next steps. Oh, I see. That's response. Sorry. Okay, never mind. Okay, go ahead. Do you want to respond to Jim's comments? Kelly, do you want to start?
Sure. So we did run originally the nominal GDP deflator and an NIH deflator versions of those graphs, but it got a little busy and hard to follow. So we decided to go with the NIH one for it.
Yeah, I just mean for publication.
It grows faster until recently, in which case it comes back to being pretty close to the 2%-ish growth that the GDP overall deflator has. As far as the countries, that's a PPP converted to US dollar equivalents, and then apply the deflator. There was a question you had during NC 1034 about cross-listing by knowledge area. Yes, you can. They do have, it'll say, in fact, I can show you.
Yeah, look, tell me later. We don't have much time left.
So you can cross, it'll say how much percentage is applied to each one. This is also specifically a methane in animals one, just like you asked last time. And I looked through some of them, they will also include climate, but most of them just say animal physiology. So that's to answer your question from Anaheim.
Okay.
You're muted, Carl.
Greg, did you want to comment? Okay, why don't we go, Matt, comment?
Spiro has question.
I'm sorry?
Spiro has question.
Well, I was going to go through with a quick answer on these, and then Matt, do you want to respond quickly or not?
Yeah, I don't have that much to say other than thanks for the helpful suggestions. I mean, this is the classic example of why you present the paper, and you know, I'll think about it.
Okay, Sun Ling, or should we hear what Spiro has as a question?
So quick response. So thanks for Jim's comments. I will ask you later regarding the paper, the output and the TAP growth. And also, actually, yeah, we suspect there's already a relative slowdown, and we will make some more empirical studies based on that. Thank you.
Okay, great. Spiro, do you want to add your
Thanks.
question?
Great set of papers, nice themes here that are being addressed. So let me give you a perspective here, some conversations I've had with a focus group looking at R&D and incentives for getting more private capital in place, basically get more manufacturing in the US and have it be done in the US, kind of invent it here and make it here kind of agenda. And in talking with some research leaders, research officers at universities and private investors in this group, they focus on, let's see, the agriculture tends to rely on very patient capital. So IP is not as big a concern in advancing the impact of R&D. And so that's the kind of conversation they're having. And in fact, it's what's the limiting factor? Part of my questioning was, is the regulatory climate limiting, and thinking of like buy dole, where you get the public money and you have to, you need to substantially manufacture it in the US. They don't see that as a limiting factor. The limiting factor tends to be the average number of partners that are available. And so they find very few partners available. So that's kind of at the micro level at universities looking at these things. This is one of the issues that are there. And then they kind of come up with the concern that just the observation that the vast majority of advances arising from ag R&D, public R&D, is that it's not IP registered. So they're looking for incentives and lowering the cost of reporting, and trying to have systems here in place that we can develop a better catalog. So now you folks are talking about databases that are pretty interesting, that are starting to do an inventory of innovations and registrations of those innovations. And we're trying to do it in the public sector using a system like iEdison, that NIFA uses that, a number of other departments use that. So it's a matter of kind of seeing what's IP registered, and a lot of the ag stuff isn't. So I kind of like a reaction from several of you there. I think Matt and Greg and in particular might have some input here.
I ask one quick follow-up on Shapiro. The folks that were can't find partners and those were primarily universities, or were they private?
They're universities. University of California, Mississippi State, Michigan State University were part of this conversation. So, so it's not, I'm just trying to find out where there is a disconnect.
Yeah.
Or, where's the gap here?
Communication problem here. Greg, did you want to respond, or Matt?
That your comments are very well taken, Spiro, and it actually brings up about 3 veins of conversation I'd like to have with you about that. But the one that I'll comment on right now is that one of the motivating factors in putting together this data set of ag tech startup companies was if you will, the trope about startups, university startups, or startups spinning out of ARS or whatnot, being one of the vehicles enabled under Bayh-Dole to commercialize technologies arising, inspired by results from public sector research. What we found was that, in fact, that's an easier story to tell than it is to actually document in the data. So taking Jim's comment to heart that case studies may be one of the best ways to go about telling that story on a case-by-case basis, But what we were hoping to be able to find in doing this, especially the matching to the intellectual property, was finding co-assignment or some sort of a telltale, whether it's inventor address, some sort of telltale that the founding of the company was rooted in a land-grant university or federally funded research. What we've come up with so far are empty hands on this, but we're getting to know the data well enough that hopefully we can begin to tell that story. Then the rest of the startup story is, however, also that of exits. And those are by and large acquisitions by the larger and unfortunately more concentrated players in the industry typically. Very seldom are we seeing startup companies growing into maturity. Indigo Ag may be one that still makes it, but the jury's out on them. There are not very many others. There may be niches that these startups can occupy and thus diffuse some of the concentration in the industry. We are hopeful in Colorado and have a number of initiatives bubbling here in the Front Range, trying to link up partnerships between CSU, other universities in the area. University of Northern Colorado is one that comes to mind, University of Colorado Boulder, and the federal labs and the startups to then advance technological developments that can then become of interest to our big corporate incumbent players. For us here in the Front Range, it's Ardent Mills, or it's JBS, Nutrien are a few that come to mind. They're attracted somewhat to the startup sector, but they're very, very different cultures. And getting the connections to gel in terms of advancing R&D projects with them is still more of an aspiration than a reality.
Let's see. Matt, go ahead.
I was just going to chime in to say the notion that I guess universities say intellectual property rights are not a big part of it. That's consistent with sort of what we found in the sense that they don't patent almost at all in the agricultural space. In earlier work, we looked at a lot of, actually to this question that Jim had brought up about the linkages between non-agricultural R&D and R&D, and we looked at how patents cite, for example, academic papers. And that was one way we tried to get at that. And yeah, I mean, I think the trade-off with patents is that they give you a really good data on a subset of inventions. And so to the extent that that subset is non-representative, they're not useful. But if they're representative of stuff, of what's going on that isn't ultimately getting patented, then I think you can pull a lot of interesting stuff about the local linkages and, you know, what gets cited and maybe even the movement of inventors across different places. But
of course, the other thing from your preliminary regressions there was the lack of significant relationship between public sector research and your private sector numbers.
Yeah, that's right. And I you know, it was a preliminary, just sort of baseline correlation, so I don't want to lean too much on it, but I certainly noticed that too. And you know, it's consistent in my mind with falling support amid rising private sector in recent years, but not in the past. So it does seem like they're not tightly coupled, and at least that didn't strike me as an obvious wrong finding.
Yeah, I'll just chime in here. You know, I spent a little time at University of Florida, and they're still looking for the next Gatorade. Okay, so you know, that's
everybody's looking for the next Gatorade.
So that was 1965 to 67, and they're still living off a lot of that money. But they're still doing a lot of patenting on a lot of specialty crop varieties. You know, and so they're really kind of in the business, as it were, rather than doing research for basic form. But you know, the one other comment I want to make here is, you know, the demand for R&D. Okay. In the private sector, you know, you'll look at the R&D what's going to stimulate the demand for R&D? Maybe it's, what productivity growth trends have been. Productivity is strong. It's going to be a disincentive for R&D. So there'll be there's this dynamic disincentive on the private side. On the public side, there are 535 people who determine the public R&D. They all don't have the same voice, and they have a lot of pressure on them. And if you get $100 million for potato research, you have a pretty good idea where that came from. Susan Collins and me. So you have an entirely different dynamic on the demand for R&D from the public side. And while the private side is pretty substantial, of course, we have two different drivers here at play. And so how does that dynamic influence the evolution of the R&D? I tell my undersecretary and colleagues, well, you look at that trend line up there for China R&D, but what's been their productivity growth? What's been the impact of that investment? And Sun Ling's results show that, well, while we have fairly modest R&D patterns here, we've been pretty productive with it, and so we've got our bang for the buck. So it's a complex dynamic in place with the public and the private, and it's the evolution of the allocation. So we're not going to figure that out today or next year either. But I really appreciate hearing all these presentations.
I think we're a little over time, but I think this was a really very interesting set of papers, and great discussion, great comments from Jim, Spiro, and Krishna, who's gone. It's I think we need to communicate to AAEA that we had a great session and we should have had more people listening. and we need to figure out they need to figure out some way with these seminars, or whatever we're calling them, these sessions, how to get more people into them.
Fortunately, it is recorded, so
exactly, and that's the other thing, is to get that out. That's right. So thanks a lot for you guys, all of you, and I thought it was a really interesting session, and I have some new papers that I should be reading, I think. And I guess what's happening with the PowerPoints? Are they going to be available somehow, or what are we doing with that? Do you know, Sun Ling?
No, so just a recorded video will be uploaded to the system. By the paper, I think we can circulate them among our group. And also next year, just a heads up, ERS is going to organize a productive workshop in late March. So I think we are going to invite everybody on this panel to present your final results.
Oh, that's right. You've got the hardcore here, both in terms of papers and also in terms of great comments and discussion. So thanks again, Sun Ling, for organizing this, and thanks to everybody for attending and making this into a really interesting session.
Thank you.
Okay, bye now.
Thank you, Carl, for leading the charge.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. Okay, great. Thank you.